I think the mindset with parents has to be, it's not just that porn is out there. It's that porn is seeking our kids out. It's aggressively seeking our kids out.
Today on the Maven Parent Podcast, we are joined by a special guest, Greta Eskridge, and she is a new friend to us here at Maven. I met Greta a couple years ago, actually through mutual friends. But I've been looking forward to having you on the podcast, Greta, and exposing you to our audience who may not know you, but some of them maybe already do know you. But you're an author and a speaker. You're in ministry. You're a parent. So you're in the trenches with all of us too. So thank you so much for being on the Maven Parent Podcast.
I'm super excited to be here. I've been looking forward to it.
Oh, good. Well, okay, we want to start with you introducing yourself to our audience. So kind of the street cred part.
Okay.
Tell us about Greta. So we'll start with how you grew up. What kind of home did you grow up in?
Because there's a rumor that you were a PK.
I was a PK, an MK, and an HK homeschooled kid.
Oh, so, I was like, what's an HK?
That's called the trifecta. I don't know if I've ever met a PK, MK, HK.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think I've proved to you that my street cred is real. It's legit. Yes, I was homeschooled from 4th grade till I graduated from high school. I graduated at 16 because it was like,
because you were super smart?
No, I was just like, hey, I'm ready to be done, Mom. And she's like, okay, you probably know enough. No, I'm sure there was more to it than that. But, you know, homeschoolers, we can sort of create our own path.
Yeah.
And
which, I mean, that's like a whole nother topic about kind of maybe the delay. You know, we have these kids graduating at 17 and 18 when they probably could have graduated 14, 15. You know, there was a time when kids were done with some of their formal schooling at 12 anyway. But, so not abnormal in the history of humanity.
That, yes, I hope that I am not too abnormal, just mildly abnormal. And I loved being homeschooled. My parents, they didn't really know much about homeschooling, but that happened to be really the only option for us at the time. They didn't want to put us in traditional public school for a variety of reasons. And then I just flourished. I loved it. Mostly because I get to read a lot and babysit a lot, which made me so happy. Yeah. And my dad was a pastor. He actually just retired this past year, and he was a missionary as well. And so, yeah, I grew up in a pretty traditional Christian home, pretty conservative, and absolutely loved it.
Was your family on the mission field?
My dad did short-term missions. My mom and my younger brother have a variety of health problems that didn't allow them to go. So he would go. And I actually went with him my first time when I was 16. We went to India for 6 weeks. So I got to travel around the world when I was a teen because I was homeschooled and I had the freedom to do it. So I was convinced like by 13 that when I had kids, I would homeschool because I just loved the life. And then in between being a homeschool graduate and then homeschooling my own kids, I taught public high school for 5 years, which I also loved. But that was just a crazy experience because it was my first time in public school. And I was really young and my students laughed at me constantly because I was so naive. But we had a great time and I'm still good friends with some of those kids.
Oh.
So, yeah.
No,
Okay. Well, I was just going to ask, okay, so you grow up in a Christian home. Most people listening are Christians, raising their kids in a Christian home, but it doesn't guarantee
that's true
that our kids become Christians. So
I was going to say, most homeschoolers come out of the womb saved. But Greta, when did you?
Oh, you were going to ask the same question.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're tracking with each other. That's good.
So the question is, can I guess?
You're looking at me like you want to redo this question?
No. So I'm curious, when you actually, made the faith your own, was it when you were small and a journey? It's different for everybody.
I was actually 3 years old and I remember it. I was in the kitchen with my mom and I said, Mom, I want to ask, or I probably said, Mommy, I want to ask Jesus in my heart. And she prayed with me. And I mean, it was real. Like I remember it and I've never felt a need to like have a redo because that faith was real. I think my parents did a really powerful job of showing me faith in action and faith that wasn't just for show. It was the way they lived their life. And they never made it feel like this was something I had to choose, but it was honestly something that I wanted to choose.
Well, it's refreshing to hear you talk about your family and your home life this way, because I think there's kind of this modern trend in, I think, the Christian world to kind of badmouth the growing up in a Christian home and all of the bad things about it, whether it was the fundamentalist leanings, or whether it was purity culture, or whether it was this or the hypocrisy or that. And obviously we know there are bad things that happen in Christian homes, but there's a lot of us, and I would say the same thing as you, like growing up in a Christian home with parents who love the Lord, who of course weren't perfect, but they were faithful and they modeled some really good things for me, like your parents modeled for you. And that is just a huge blessing that it's really good for us to step back, especially as parents, and recognize that's a really good thing.
Right.
And so for parents, kind of laying out this model of faithfulness. Yeah. And again, imperfection. So there's lots of grace.
Right.
But faithfulness to the Lord, to his kingdom work can really help build a legacy.
Yeah. And I always recognize, like you said, that my parents didn't do everything right, but they did the best they could with what they had. When they messed up, they admitted it, said they were sorry. And I just think that's a really powerful witness, instead of saying we have all the answers. And they were just they really loved us, and they did their best. And so that's just what I've tried to do for our kids, and pray that they will look at me the same way, me and my husband, and be like, yeah, Mom and Dad messed up on this, but they did their best. And, we can trust God that he'll make up for the areas where we lack.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you specifics, or if there's memories of certain things that for your mind encompass what you said about your parents, that they lived out their faith. But I think apologizing is a good one.
Yeah.
Because that's something, as parents, it's a humbling thing to have to do, to apologize to your kids. But were there other examples that, especially when you think back on your childhood, that you look back and say, this was my parents living out Christianity, not just we go to church on Sunday,
Right.
Dad, in your case, Dad preaches.
Yeah.
Were there certain things just, parents, especially of young kids, can be like, okay, I could do that.
Right. I think the things that stand out the most to me were not necessarily things that I loved as a kid, but now as an adult, I think, wow, they were so powerfully shaping. Like my parents were very intentional about serving other people. And so like I can remember we had a family at church that their son was in a tragic motorcycle accident, paralyzed from the neck down. And he eventually was brought home, and he needed to have all this physical therapy done that required like a team of people, because he was a big guy. Like he would fill this table, and it required, this is so random. You're going to be so sad you asked me to mention this, but like it required like putting lotion like on his limbs to help stimulate nerves, and then doing these movements where we would hold like his leg, different people would be holding his legs and arms and helping his body move to try to get his brain and body to talk to each other again. And I remember being a little kid, like 10, and being so grossed out, like having to rub lotion on this guy's hairy legs or arms and hold them. And my brother and I being like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we have to do this again. But what a powerful example to just show up for this family that needed us and couldn't do this on their own. And my parents didn't leave us at home, which would have been way easier for them, right? Because then we wouldn't have grumbled or complained. They invited us in and had an expectation that we would be there and reminded us that service and loving other people isn't always glamorous. Oftentimes it's not. In fact, it's a sacrifice. But those kind of things we did often as a family, and it was all of us. And it's really shaped who I was, but I didn't always love it when I was a kid. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, we talk about that a lot on the podcast, about one of our jobs as parents is to make our kids do things they don't necessarily want to do.
Yeah.
And we understand that in some areas, like food. We understand our kids would eat M&Ms and McDonald's every day if we let them do that. But we understand with nutrition, okay, we can't just feed them this. They don't know what's good for them. And that's what your parents understood on a spiritual, emotional level, is that we have to do things that our kids don't necessarily want to do. And they don't know what's good for them.
Right.
But we know that serving this young man and his family is going to be good for little 10-year-old Greta.
Right.
Even though she's saying, Mom, I don't want to do this. Can I please stay home?
Right.
And that's an important part of parenting that your parents understood. And I think, we all need that encouragement, because when our kids grumble, we have those moments where we think, I don't know, should I? Right. It is easier just to leave them home.
It is.
So grow up as a PK, MK, HK. How do you, what's the transition here? How do you get into parenting, marriage and parenting? What's the story there?
Let's see, my husband and I met when I think I was 18, first boyfriend, because my dad was pretty strict about dating. We actually went on a mission trip together with my dad so he could really try this guy out.
Oh, very good.
Really?
Yeah, I love that.
Your father was wise.
Do you want to date my daughter? We're going on the mission field together.
And if I don't like you, you may not come back from the mission field.
Yeah, he passed the test. We'll actually celebrate our 25th anniversary this coming June.
Oh,
so we were married a long time.
Married?
I was 21 and he was 23.
Nice.
We were so young and so poor, and we grew up together. And I think that it has been hard in some parts of our journey, but also so good. And we have 4 kids now. We've homeschooled them from the beginning, and
currently ages
19, 17, 15, 12.
Okay. You're in the thick of things.
Yes. And they're great. I absolutely love teenagers. My 12-year-old is almost a teenager, so we're just pushing through those preteen years. And I'm like, dear Lord, let me get through one last preteen, because I think preteens are harder than teens. That's just my personal experience.
What do you think the preteen is? It just because there's so many hormone changes during that time. Yeah.
And I feel like they're like toddlers with their big emotions and all of that's just raging around in their head, and they haven't yet transitioned enough into maturity to be able to like handle it all. And so like we were discussing earlier, like the act of saying, brush your hair, brush your teeth. It's like, it's shocking to them. And you say it, you do this every day. And yet it's just, it's difficult.
Yes.
But then they hit like, for my kids, it's like they hit like 14 and it was like suddenly you're like, hey, you got to brush your hair. And they're like, okay. Like, oh my gosh, the angels are singing from heaven.
We've arrived.
Yeah.
So someone listening with a 4-year-old is going, oh, shoot, I still have 10 years of reminding them to brush their teeth. Yes, you probably do. So just buckle up. It's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So mom of multiple teenagers.
Yeah.
And all right. So how did you get to the point where you're addressing this topic? I mean, this is the topic that pretty much, it seems, lots of parents want to just avoid. They want it to go away. Obviously, we can't do that. But so what sparked your interest on this one? How did you get involved with addressing this for parents?
At first, it was just because I wanted to help my own family, my own kids. Like how can I help them grow up in a world that's saturated with pornography? And I will backtrack a little to say, as a kid and a teen myself, I was not exposed to pornography. I didn't have to deal with this. My parents were able to just give me, a little bit of information, stay safe. And that was it, because it was just a different time. And it was actually when I was a public high school teacher and I had a 9th grade student who had a wildly inappropriate picture in his binder. And I was shocked. And I was like, what are you doing? Why do you have this? What's going on? And that was kind of my first exposure to even the idea of, oh, I'm going to have kids. I didn't have kids yet, but I'm going to have kids growing up in this world. What will I do? And so I just started learning. And the more I learned, the more I realized the immensity of the situation. And I started talking to friends that were moms, and nobody wanted to talk about it really. I was making everyone uncomfortable. And
oh no, here comes Greta.
Yeah, kind of.
She's going to talk to us about porn again.
Yeah, that's it. And so I actually started sharing on my social media platforms, and the response was overwhelming from moms who said, we just need help. We know this is something we have to talk to our kids about, but we don't know how. And will you do all the work and the reading? Because we're afraid of even picking up a book that has the word pornography in the title, and just tell us what to do. And so it is not the ministry I necessarily would have chosen, to be honest. I think, gosh, Lord, I would like to talk about something more fun. But it's so needed. And I know it's changing lives. And so here I am.
Do you think part of the fear that so many of us have in talking about it, that part of it is actually increased because we avoid talking about it? So you have not avoided it. You're like, let's talk about it. Have you found in yourself that that's helped you? Like you're bringing light to it, and that actually is better overall.
Yes, 100%. Because when I first started, I could hardly say the word pornography out loud. It felt so, I was so embarrassed. I was so afraid. I hadn't even dealt with it in my life personally, and I still felt shame talking about it. It was just overwhelming. And I mean, I can recall the first time I spoke about it in public, and then first time on a podcast, first time on a stage, and I was terrified and so wildly uncomfortable. But the more I have talked about it, and the more I've learned, and the more I see people that are hurting and desperately need help and hope, then God has really taken that fear and anxiety away, and instead replaced it with compassion and love, and even a boldness that does not make sense.
Do you think a lot of parents, I'm wondering if some of the fear that parents experience as well is because they have their own sexual brokenness.
Totally.
And so it forces them to even confront and think about their own sexual brokenness. And they out of love for their kid, they so desperately don't want their kids to go down that route. But I can see that being a big kind of obstacle of fear.
Oh, I think that's definitely true. And I mean, I've experienced that talking to so many different families, to moms and dads, and people who are currently using pornography. And so they're like, this is a struggle in my own life right now. How could I tell my own kids not to do this? And I think that's all the work of Satan, because he wants us to feel like there's no way that we can solve this problem. There's no hope. And I don't think that that's true.
Okay, so one of the things that I appreciate how you come at this topic is is the idea of teaching our kids not to objectify people.
Yeah.
Which I think, and you talk about this, of course, pornography is kind of the biggest example of how we can take a human being and then objectify them.
Right.
But it actually applies to lots of areas in our culture where we dehumanize people and objectify them, put them in a group.
Right.
And then, you can see it politically, racially, you can see it in all kinds of areas. But so maybe start with talking about this underlying worldview underneath pornography, which is that we can objectify human beings.
Right. I think the idea that God created humans in his image and that we are, as humans, we are worthy of respect and honor because we are his creation. I think our world is obviously clearly trying to get rid of that, right? If there's no respect for life that God created, then you can view human beings as expendable, as people that you can just use for your own purpose, for however you want to use them, and then get rid of them. And so I think if we begin from the time our kids are little, teaching them that they are made in God's image, that their whole body, every part of them was perfectly designed for a purpose, and their bodies are beautiful and amazing. And then we don't just stop there. We say, but also so is grandma, even though she walks slowly, or so is, the kid next door who has to be in a wheelchair, or just however we look at all of humanity. And we give them this idea starting from the time they're little that we're made in God's image. Our bodies are beautifully created and designed by him. That is an antidote to objectification. And it doesn't even start with a talk about it being sexual objectification. It's just saying, wow, God made you and you are incredible because he made you in his image. And so is mom and dad and everybody else.
So it's starting with Genesis 1, not starting at Genesis 3, not starting with the fall and the effects of the fall and the sinfulness.
Right.
Which is, obviously something we need to address, but oftentimes I think we as Christians will start with kind of the no.
Yeah.
Right. And you're saying, hey, no, starting point. And that's the starting point for so much of how we frame stuff.
Right.
Is Genesis 1, God's good creation, God's original design, God's, the way he's made human beings.
Yeah.
And made them male and female, and his design for marriage and the family is all good stuff.
Yes.
And that's how we want to frame that for our kids, and I think that's what you're hitting on. And so if parents are thinking about where do I start to talk about porn?
Right.
Well, it's almost like, you don't start with the topic of porn.
Right.
You're starting with this larger picture of God's good design.
Yes.
And that helps you to see that this conversation begins at a really young age.
Right.
It's not like, okay, when they are teenagers, now I got to address this.
Right.
You're actually addressing this all along.
Yes, because I think also when we teach our kids from the start that they are beautifully designed by God, made for a purpose, and that, again, every part of their body is made for a purpose, that even leads into a healthy view of sexuality and sex, instead of it being like, okay, we're not going to talk about it, we're afraid of it, and then we're going to say, don't do it until you're married, and that's it. Instead, if you're saying, oh, every part of your body, like God designed even the sexual parts of your body, they're purposeful. Like he made them for a reason, and to work a certain way, and to work with your mate with a certain way, like that's all part of his plan. And I think that frames it, like you said, under the guise of God's good plan, and it's good. And as Christians, sometimes we forget that God's purpose for sex is good. Like it's not a bad thing. And we're afraid to talk about it, and we get uncomfortable. And instead we can say, God's plan was good, and pornography is an example of that being taken by Satan and warped and turned into something that is not good. So let's start from the beginning by showing our kids all the goodness of God's design. And I think that's a powerful first step.
Yeah. Okay. So feel free to, listeners, we're going to point you to some good resources.
Yeah, I have a resource for that. Thank you.
But thinking of the little ones, we'll start with the little ones. Okay. And you advocate for talking to kids when they're young.
Yeah.
Of course, what we just talked about, laying the Christian worldview, helping them to understand God's good design. Now, what age range do you think you start introducing Satan takes God's good design and twists it, and makes what God intended for good and turns it into evil? Are there good resources, or even how did you start talking to your kids around what age about there is some bad stuff out there?
Right. Well, I think when they're really small, like under the age of like 5 or 6, you're simply laying the groundwork of you're made in God's image. His design is good. And this is a great book. God made me in his image. This is a great book for it. And it sort of it has nothing to do with the idea of talking about pornography or even sex, but just God designed your body beautifully. And that's wonderful for those younger kids. Another one that's great by the same team is God Made All of Me. And this one is actually the first book to talk about helping kids protect their bodies. And again, you're not having to introduce the idea of pornography yet, or anything sexual, but more just their body is worthy of respect and honor because they're made by God, right?
Yeah.
So that's how you start when they're real little. But I would say after the age of like 6 or 7, especially now because so many kids are on screens, they're on tablets for playing games or tablets for school or, computers, or even just around other kids who have phones. And they can be accidentally exposed to something so easily. That's when you need to really introduce the idea of pornography. But I always tell parents, because they freak out. They're like, what? My kid's 7 and I have to teach them about pornography. And I always say you give them the least amount of information possible in order to protect them. So you don't give them any details. And in fact, at that age, they don't even need to know that pornography and sex are connected. You just say something like, hey, there's this thing called pornography. It's bad for your body and your brain and your heart. It's not God's plan. It's my job to keep you safe. You give them a really, really brief explanation of what it is and what to do if they see it.
So I'm going to pause.
Yes, pause.
Because I'm just thinking of a parent saying, okay, I need a little more detail. Like what is it that I say to the 7-year-old? Is it like, hey, there'll be people who don't have clothes on?
Yep.
Is it simple as that?
Simple as that. And you can say people with no clothes on, so we can see their privates, which we know privates are sacred and they're private, so we don't show them to anyone. And it could be in a picture or a movie. And if someone shows you that on their phone, or you accidentally see something when you're playing a game or looking something up on the computer, here's what I want you to do. And then, turn it off, turn it over, walk away. I always told my kids, I don't want to look at that if someone showed them, so that they know they have the power to say, this isn't something I want to engage in, and then come talk to us immediately. And that could be the whole conversation. It takes like 1 minute.
Yeah.
But at that age, it gives them the tools so that if they are exposed accidentally, which is possible at this age, they aren't paralyzed with fear or just shock. Instead, it's just like a fire drill, or you tell your kids what to do when you go to Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm, and you say, if you get lost, here's what I want you to do. It's just planning ahead.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be scary. It feels scary for us as parents, but the kids, they don't have all the baggage that we do, and they're not weighed down. They're just like, okay, I'll do it.
I like giving them the words to say too, because that's helpful. I think when you're told, you can just say, I don't want to look at that.
Right.
That's a short, quick way to help ingrain in them.
Right.
Here's the words to say too. And this is what we want you to do. And then come tell us so we can, process it with you or whatever. But yeah, I think the point about the 6, 7, 8-year-old and starting to prepare them basically to defend themselves is important, because even if we're not giving them the phones, unfortunately, lots of kids around those ages now have access. They have their own iPad or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not just the phone. Yeah. Like where would be some of the avenues that parents have to watch out for? So of course you got your smartphone. Right. Are there other things that parents need to be?
Yeah. I mean, of course, video games, because video games, a lot of times have sexualized content, but that isn't even, because you're like, oh, my kid plays Mario Kart or whatever. There's no sexualized content on that. But a lot of video games, there are strangers have access to your kids on video games. And a stranger could pretend to be somebody else and a kid their age and show a pornographic image to your kid through their Nintendo Switch.
So like if you're streaming.
Yeah.
And
and so a kid has their headphones on because you don't want to hear the game, and they're playing not on the screen in the living room, they're playing on the little handheld device, but it's connected to the internet. And if you haven't disabled that, and people can access your kids and you have no idea. But even like books in the library, like erotic books that are written for like 12-year-old girls, that's one of the most common ways young girls get introduced to pornography, and they're put in just the young adult or tween section that a girl just picks up, and you as a parent, you aren't thinking I have to worry about my kid, the books they're reading, or anime, which is a style of drawing that lots and lots of kids that are like tweens. My 12-year-old loves Pokemon still. And Pokemon is an anime style. It's when it ventures into becoming really sexualized that's a way kids get access to and an appetite for sexualized images. And then they explore farther. And there's a lot of really, really dark anime material that kids can access. And you as a parent, again, you're like, oh, they're just looking at cartoons. They're just drawing cartoons and looking at those books and those websites. It's fine. So we do have to be aware.
Yeah, and this is where I think the mindset with parents has to be, it's not just that porn is out there, it's that porn is seeking our kids out. It's aggressively seeking our kids out.
Yeah.
And so, this is where it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Right.
And so kind of some of the stuff you're talking about is preemptive.
Right.
Saying, hey, I want to start the conversation first with my kid.
Yeah.
Even before they get to that. So they know, hey, this is a topic I can, hopefully I can talk to mom and dad about. Like they've already brought it up with me. And kind of, robbed it of some of its mysteriousness or, some of the distance.
Right.
And that it's like, okay, yeah, we have to be prepared for this very aggressive thing that's coming after our kids.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the whole idea of talking to our kids before is scary, but just as more and more social science is done, I was just reading something again last week about how talking to your kids first before they are exposed to all kinds of things, not just pornography, but just even different religious views and all kinds of things like that it actually helps them to stay grounded in their Christian faith. Yeah. And it actually helps them to trust us if we actually talk to them about things first. Because instead of being like, oh my gosh, I don't know what this is. Yeah. It's instead their response is, oh, this is what mom was talking about. Right. This is what dad warned me about. I know I can go talk to him. And we had friends whose 8-year-old, I think he was either 8 or 9, and was waiting to be picked up from a after school activity. And just another boy who was waiting to be picked up too had porn on his iPad. And, they had protected and all the things, but they they had a good talking relationship with their 8 and 9-year-old. So the first thing he did when he got in the car was tell them what he had seen.
Right.
Now, of course, they were so grieved by that, but their son talked to them, and then they kept talking to him. So even though they hadn't actually had explicit talks about porn,
right,
they had talked to him about his body and some of the things we're talking about. And that helped him to trust them then, even in a situation where he was like, I don't actually know what to do, but I know I can talk to mom and dad.
Yeah.
So
that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot for setting that stage of just openness with your kids. And I think like what you said earlier about by like in my story, like talking about this topic more, it helped alleviate my fear and the shame and the discomfort that happens for our kids too, when they are like, oh, mom and dad are okay talking about these uncomfortable things. It becomes less scary. So if something happens, they just feel better prepared and more able to come to us.
Yeah. Okay. So next stage then with kids. So now you've talked to them about their bodies. Now, the next step of protecting their body and that. So then how and kind of when do you think it's good to introduce them specifically to this issue of pornography? Maybe we talked about it a little bit, but maybe a little bit older kids now.
Yeah. So here, I'll show you a couple of resources I think are handy. This one I would actually be for that 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old.
Okay.
Bad pictures.
If you feel like you can't have that conversation that I gave you a sample of, like when you say, hey, this is what pornography is, and you just give them that real short information. If you're like, oh, I can't do it. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
A book like this is a great resource because it gives you a script, which sometimes we need in the beginning.
Yeah.
I never recommend a parent just read it straight out to their kid. You should always read it first because you might not need to read all of it to your kid. But then once you get past that age where you're giving just the most minimal amount of information, you need to give them more. I think puberty is a great time to start that because their body's changing. You need to give them information about that, just about themselves. And that's also a good time to introduce the idea of, hey, remember we've talked about pornography. It's bad for you. And you know that already. And now I just need to tell you a little bit more. It's also bad for other people because it teaches you to look at other people in a way that takes away their humanity. And it's called objectification. That's a great time for them to start to learn what that looks like. I also think it's a great time for you to teach your kids to be like media literate. And that means like being able to say, oh, that commercial that I saw, they're trying to get me to buy crackers by selling it with sex. And like my kids, I think they were empowered because they would feel like, oh yeah, they're trying to trick me. And we drove past, like I remember one time we were driving past like El Pollo Loco, a Mexican restaurant that had this chip, like this huge chip on the window, and it was like all pixelated. So it looked like it was, an unclear picture. And it said underneath the chip, it's like, go topless. And my kids were like, oh my gosh, they're using sex to get us to buy chips from El Pollo Loco. And so you have this great conversation about how, like you said, that pornography is coming to look for them. Yeah. The pornified culture they're growing up in is trying to get them to think that pornography is just normal and it's no big deal. And getting them to begin to see those messages that are out there, that age when they're starting to be able to think and reason, their body's changing, their brain is growing to understand more. That's a good time to introduce more of these topics. And then you just add more information as needed as they grow through their teen years.
Yeah. And, I can imagine parents are like, oh, I don't want my kid to notice. I don't want them to see. And there's a part of that where you're like, yeah, when your kids are 4 and 5,
of course,
yeah,
they won't notice.
Right. They won't notice, and you don't want them to notice those things. But when they're 12 and 13, you're still not wanting them to notice. You are not going to be preparing them for the real world. Yeah. We live in a fallen, broken, rebellious world. And so there's a reality that, we want to prepare them for. And so actually, by the time they're in middle school, high school, and they're noticing that we can, that's actually a good thing. Because if they notice, then they're not just going to be taken in by these things.
They're not absorbing it mindlessly and then beginning to think it's the truth. Instead, they're like calling it out and saying, that's a lie.
Yeah.
I want to speak truth. And if you create that environment in your home, it's so powerful for them to be able to talk about it together. There's no embarrassment. It's like we are all able to support one another in seeking out the truth. And I agree. I wish that wasn't the world our kids were growing up in. But since it is, I would rather my kids be empowered to fight against the lies of the enemy than to just pretend it's not happening.
Yeah. And I think you've talked about what porn can do to a kid's brain.
Yeah.
I think that's an important piece for parents to understand, especially for those parents who are still feeling like hesitant and nervous about this. Understanding the potential danger, the addiction, what's going on in terms of, brain chemistry, to help parents, I guess, be motivated. Like, this is really an important issue because of what can go on physically. So talk a little bit about the dangers of, addiction and, the dopamine stuff and what are good resources on this as well?
Okay. I have a few. This is from a book called Behind Closed Doors by a woman named Dr. Jessica Peck. And she's a nurse. And she just wrote this book to address some of the things that she hears from her teen patients when they come into her office. And she has a chapter on pornography. And she talks specifically about the brain and chemical reactions. So I'm going to read it because she's going to say it way better than me. She says teens are especially vulnerable to, and that would be kids that are younger than teens as well. They're especially vulnerable to chemical reactions and brain changes associated with repeated pornography exposure. Teen brains are neuroplastic. That means they grow and adapt by creating new pathways based on chemical influences. Their hormones, we know they're raging, and environmental influences, which is pornography. So what is happening is their brains are growing at this amazing rate. And if they're exposed to something like pornography repeatedly, it actually creates new pathways, like ruts in the brain. And medical researchers are making it akin to brain damage. And so, especially for kids that as their brains are growing, when you combine pornography with masturbation, that is such a powerful drive that it becomes this habit that is so difficult to break. And imagine if you start that as a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old, and then how hard it's going to be for you to break those habits and those pathways your brain has developed as a teenager, how hard it's going to be for you to change as an adult. And so as parents, again, we don't want to think about this. We don't want to face it because it's scary and it's overwhelming. But if instead we can imagine, what is the positive effect that could come from us talking to our kids? What's the ripple effect of good? I like to imagine, what if the Lord is using us as parents now to create a generation of kids that have been told, this isn't the truth. Pornography is a lie. God has something so much better for you. Let's choose his good plan instead. And that comes from parents who are willing to step into the uncomfortable place and help their kids see that there is something better.
And it isn't just an issue with boys.
Correct.
And that's something, so if you're listening, you have boys, it's probably on your radar. But boy or girl, it should be on our radar as parents. So you mentioned books and the tween books, and I definitely have been very aware of how those kinds of books are pushed onto girls.
Yeah.
But maybe just mention why even for girls, this is as parents of girls, we need to care about this issue too.
I think there's two reasons. Like if I think of my own daughter, maybe three. Number one, I would never want her to watch pornography and see herself as the girl or the woman in that position who is being used and abused and treated so horribly, and to think that that is her and that she is worth so little to be treated that way. And there are so many girls who that is what they're seeing, and they're terrorized and terrified because of what they're being exposed to. And I don't want that for her. I also don't want her to date or to marry a man who is struggling and has struggled so deeply with porn in his life, and to bring that into their marriage. I want her to have the knowledge to be able to like identify these are potential problems, and to even say, hey, if you are looking at porn all the time, I'm not interested in dating you. Like that's a powerful thing for her to be able to say. Uncomfortable, but I hope she's brave enough. I want to give her the tools to be able to. But also just as so third reason, just as a young woman growing up, seeing the world of pornography, I want her to recognize that it isn't just a guy problem, that it could impact her personally or impact the people that she loves. And I mean, now or later on in marriage. And so it definitely does impact girls, because girls are consuming porn more than ever before, because it's out there looking for them.
Yeah. What are some good resources for tweens and teens that for the parent listening, and either they haven't had many conversations and they want to start doing that, or just ones that you think these are really good resources to have?
Two of my favorites that I've read with with all my kids. Well, not the youngest. We haven't done all of these with him. This one is the book, How to Talk to Your Kids About Pornography. And you can see from all those little tabs.
I know, I use tabs too
with my kids. I think that book is great for 13 plus. It says 8 years old, but I think it's a little too much I wouldn't read it with my kids under the age of 13. I like this book because you could read the chapters are super short. You could just tell your kids like, okay, guys, we're going to read a chapter from this book and have a conversation. And it talks about not just pornography is bad, but it goes into explanations of why. Like, for example, it's connected to sex trafficking, or it talks about how porn impacts their brain. And I recently I had a conversation with about 200 teens through a public charter school. And the conversation couldn't be religious because it was a public school, but they said, can you still educate them about the dangers of pornography without it being religious? And I said, yes, I can. Well, let me add them. But the thing that was remarkable to me was that so many of them told me, no one's ever talked to us about this before. No one told us it was bad for us. No one told us we didn't have to do it. We just thought everyone used porn. And so if no one's out there telling the teens, our teens or any other teen, that they have the option to say no, that it's bad for their body, their brain, and their heart, then they're going to do it because culture's telling them to. So this book, even if you have somebody who's like, oh, I'm not religious, I don't want to read one of your religious books about pornography, you could hand them that book and say, there's a lot in here for you. And I never say read it, just like don't give it to your kid to read. You need to read it with them.
Read it with them. Yeah. Okay.
And this is, I think this is where Christians need to understand that in our worldview, right? God is the creator of all reality.
Right.
And that's not just my personal belief.
Right.
That's the nature of things. That's true whether you believe it or not. So if God is the creator of all reality and he's designed human beings in a certain way, that means whether you are a believer, a Christian, or a non-believer, you're still living in that same reality.
Yeah.
You are designed in a certain way to flourish in a certain way. And so there's going to be these, these commonalities that we have in terms of our experience, and that, you can, maybe the starting point for a conversation with maybe a friend who's not a believer or a school district or is to say, hey, let's look at how this harms our kids. Let's look at how this, doesn't help them to flourish. I guess I'm just trying to think of helping Christians. Yeah. When we engage with the world, we try to be salt and light on this issue because we have some wisdom to give to the world on this, and the world is looking for wisdom on this. I mean, the sexual brokenness is just everywhere, but we don't necessarily have to start with the Bible says so. Right. We have this shared experience of reality, and we can start there. Right. And then later on, it's like, and what's interesting is that this all fits with, with the biblical picture of things. So
this book is, can I share one more?
Yes, absolutely.
This book is another one of my favorites by Sean McDowell, Chasing Love. I read that with my 3 teens last year as part of homeschool curriculum. Yeah. My 11-year-old at the time, he would say, is this a puberty talk? And and I'd say, yes. He's like, do I have to stay? No, because he's not ready for it. Yeah. And he knows, and we know, but the 3 teens and I read it together, and it's covers not just issues of pornography, but he talks about culture and how culture's trying to warp God's plan. And he talks about so many amazing things like God's design for sex. And it was a really powerful tool. So I think if you as a parent have the courage to read that book with your kids, it's a great place to have a lot of good conversations.
Yeah, if you're a youth leader, you want to do a series, have your students read this book.
Yeah,
we go through it together.
We promoted that resource on the podcast at the Maven conferences, so we love. And I'm thinking too, Greta, about so often on the podcast when we're talking about different topics, we say to parents, if you don't know where to start, or if you don't know what to say, then learn along with your kids. Yes. And I always talk about when our first daughter was so little, I was still a pretty new Christian. So to think about teaching her the Bible was so intimidating to me, because I'm like, I don't know the Bible. And so on this topic, maybe the parent who has baggage and struggles in this area, maybe as a parent, an adult, you don't even know how it affects our brain and all these things. So like we talk about all the time, read with your kids, learn along with them, and let the Holy Spirit work in your life like we're wanting him to work in our kids' lives too. Right. And so that's why I love giving resources, because it's like, okay, I can do this with my kids. Yeah. I'm not an expert on it. And so sometimes, on any given topic, we'll be like, I'm not an expert. I couldn't teach my kids. Learn with them then. And this is a great area to just say, let's do it together. And even, when your kids are older, and to admit your baggage. Yeah. And your fears, and all those things, and talk to them, as they get older and into adulthood. Yeah. It's a great way to do that.
Yeah, I've done that with my kids, where I've said, you know what, I messed up on this. Like, I should have handled this differently, or I should have talked to you about this in a different way or sooner. And I'm sorry. And I want to do better. And I think that's because I don't know all the answers. I don't at all. Yeah. And I think it's good for them to recognize, like, I will say that I messed up. I will say, I'm sorry, that I want to do better. I want to learn with you, so that they know when they mess up, they can come to me and it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of this conversation as well, as we need to make sure our kids know that they can come talk to us when they mess up, because that will happen at some point, and or it could happen at some point, and we want them to come to us and not to Google or their friends, or just to keep it all inside and be afraid to talk.
Yeah.
Are there any other practical tools that are available for parents? I mean, you've got a number of books here, but I'm thinking about the parent who's saying, okay, how about monitoring software? At what age do I think about putting a smartphone in my kids' hands? When do I give them access to, social media? What are some of the practical things that may not, these aren't things that will absolutely prevent them, but could be tools to help?
Right. Yes, there actually are a lot. And I think I love that we brought this up after we spent all the time talking about talking, because I think a lot of times parents want to just be like, I'll just put a filter on the phone and that'll be good. But we talk and then we also protect. So my number one recommendation for finding out that information is actually my friend Chris McKenna's website. It's called Protect Young Eyes. And he has tons of information about like what router you could use in your home to protect the stuff coming in. He goes through all kinds of apps. He goes through different parental control software. He's got it all. It's so easily explained. Protect Young Eyes.
ProtectYoungEyes.com.
Yes. And it's fantastic. It's my number one resource for that stuff. He'll help you out.
Okay, so I'm just curious, and because I think it's good for other parents to hear. But like, okay, so at what age did your kids ask you for a smartphone? At what age? How did you guys handle that? Because we know that's a huge doorway.
Yes.
So how did your family handle smartphones?
Our oldest got his first smartphone when he was 18. He bought it with his own money, and we set it up with him. And the idea was just like, let's not have access to that for as long as possible until it came to a point where he actually needed it, like getting a job and driving, then those being available. Our next son is 17 and he just got a smartphone because he needed it sooner, because he started working sooner and needed accessibility. But the goal in our family has always been like 17 or 18. And before that, we use a safe phone, not a smartphone. So it's a phone that doesn't have internet access. It's just for calling and texting. And then social media, also social media for us is 18 plus. I think the longer we can keep our kids away from social media, the better. And teen years, especially, they just don't need it. It's hard to walk that road. It's hard for them. It's hard for us because that is not the norm. The norm, the average age for getting your first fully loaded smartphone is 10 years old in America.
Yeah, that's why I wanted you to share that, because I want parents to hear that there are other parents who are not going along with that. We do not have to go along with the culture, but it takes courage.
Yes.
And it's going to be a little more difficult, but we got to pay that price for our kids to flourish sometimes. And so I think it's really good for other parents to hear, oh my goodness, there's some Christian parents out there who it wasn't, till 17 or 18 that their kids got smartphones. I mean, our son Micah, who's, doing all our filming stuff, he didn't get his first smartphone until he was 17. And that's unheard of now. And in the church, it needs to be more heard of.
I agree.
I wanted you to share
and
that.
It might be that you have to get, be willing to let them use your phone to make important phone calls if they need to, or say, yes, you can, text me on my mom's phone. My kids joked about it. They were like, yeah, it's embarrassing sometimes. I'm like, I know, I'm sorry. But you have to be willing to walk through the embarrassment with them, laugh with them. One of my boys said the only cyberbully he knew was me, because I wouldn't let him get on the internet very much. And I was like, right on.
That's his definition of cyberbullying.
So it's hard to walk a different road, but man, it can be really powerful.
Yeah.
Well, this has been really good. Any last resource that you wanted to share, or did you kind of get them all out there?
I have actually so many more than I could share here.
Yeah.
So if people want to find them, the best way is to look either on my website, where I have like articles I've written and links and more descriptions of these books and lots more other stuff. My website is gretaeskridge.com. Or if you find me on Instagram, that's where I have a lot of stuff as well. That's where I'm most active on social media. And I have, little scripts that people can use and websites they should visit, podcasts, just all kinds of stuff.
And we'll put some links to these things in our show links.
Yeah. So we're going to actually hang on to you. So listeners, this is actually part 1 with Greta, because one thing I love about you, Greta, is it's not just like Brett, you mentioned earlier, Christianity is not just no. Right. It's recognizing and seeing all the yeses that God provides for us, all the good things. And so you have invested a lot of time in providing resources for parents and families in the things we say yes to, which is going outside, spending time in nature, and
don't give those away.
Well, I'm just, it's a tease.
You wanted to tease them. And
okay.
Tell
so
them,
I'm not going to say
right up to the edge
any more about it. Okay.
You have to come back for this.
Okay. So you have to come back. So next episode, we're going to talk about some of the good of that God has given us as families that we can champion and look to do with our kids, good things to add to our family life. So, but thank you so much for covering this important topic.
Thanks for having me on and being willing to talk about it. That's a big deal.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.